So it's the 1700s, and the colonies don't really get along very well because they all have different interests, but they're all still American. And then there came this thing called the French and Indian War, where basically the French and the Indians fought the Americans and the British, and the British people won, and so everybody was really excited because it's like, yo, we won the war! And it turned out that the colonies were like really in debt to Britain, and the British people also had their military still in the American colonies, and the Americans were kind of a little bit upset about that because, you know, man, that's not really cool. So then the British issued something called the Sugar Act, which was where they kind of wanted to make money off the sugar they were producing. So they started taxing the colonies, and the Americans were kind of upset about this because they were like, yo, I'm not represented in Parliament, and so you're making laws that affect me without me having any say in them? But they weren't really gonna like say anything about it because it's just one thing, and they thought it would just get better over time. And then came something called the Stamp Act, where basically everything made of paper was being taxed by the British. And so the Americans were like, that is totally not cool, and they started boycotting all British goods. And then they formed something called the Stamp Act Congress, which was a bunch of like important political guys who all met together and said, yo, we're gonna like boycott Parliament and kind of ignore everything they say. And they also formed something called the Sons of Liberty, who were all these people who wanted to like fight against Parliament authority. And so they were starting to rebel, and they finally issued the phrase, no taxation without representation. And so Parliament responded with something called the Declaratory Act, where they were like, I can legislate in all cases, which was a fancy way of saying, I'm going to tax you still. And so the colonies were like, well, if we say Parliament can't tax us, and taxation is legislation, that means they can't legislate, right? So they have no authority over us. And so they were basically, at this point, denouncing Parliament altogether. And then it got even worse because the British had this big company that they were making a lot of money off of called the East India Company, and they were kind of going out of business. So Britain was like, well, we kind of need to save the company. So they passed something called the Tea Act, where they started taxing every single packet of tea that came into the Americas. And the Americans saw it as a monopoly, and they were like, yeah, that's infringing on our right to property. And they remembered this guy called John Locke, who said everybody has a right to life, liberty, and property. And so they were like, well, you're infringing on our right to property. That means we kind of have a right to rebel. So then they had the Boston Tea Party, where they just kind of threw all the tea overboard, and the British viewed this as insurgency. So Parliament responded with something called the Coercive Acts, which the Americans deemed the intolerable acts, and they basically closed down everything in the Americas, including the port of Boston. And they kind of like didn't really have any money to come in or out, and the Americans were totally just like isolated, and they were like, yo, that's totally not cool. And so they made this whole militia and a Continental Congress to make decisions for them. And so they actually started to rebel, and their military met the British military at Lexington and Concord, where they actually engaged in fighting, and people saw their soldiers dying and were like, yeah, this is a war that's about to happen. And so in 1775, they started to raise an actual army who was like led by this guy that you probably might have heard of, I don't know, some George Washington fellow. And they actually started to fight the British at some battle called Bunker Hill, which was actually the first battle of the coming Revolutionary War. And the Americans didn't really want to go away from Britain yet because they were still kind of hesitant because, you know, Britain's pretty powerful and they were like protecting them and giving them benefits, and they were like, okay, what if we try putting things back the way it was? So they issued the Olive Branch Petition, which was like, yo, it's cool, we can go back to how it was 7 years ago and it'll be totally fine, just stop taxing us. And the British responded with a blockade. And the Americans were like, yep, this is the end, we're no longer friends. And then came a guy called Thomas Paine, who wrote a book called Common Sense, and he was like, guys, wake up and smell the coffee, because the king is pretty evil and he's kind of hurting us on purpose. And all the Americans read this book and they were like, okay, we are going to revolt now. And the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, and that's how the Revolutionary War started.